Siren echoes scraped the night as Elena Reed clutched Mason against her chest and stared at the door that still trembled from Daniel's exit. The apartment smelled of burnt coffee and fear, and the hallway light stuttered like a failing heartbeat. The narrator watched Elena breathe to 4, then 8, a ritual she learned in harder years. Daniel said, "You'll regret this," and the words still crawled along the walls. Mason said, "Mom, are we safe?" and her answer was steady though her hands shook. Elena said, "Yes, baby, I'm here," and the promise cut through the noise like a clean blade. A siren swelled and faded, leaving a hush that felt thinner than paper. She gathered scattered documents from the floor, each one a shard of a life she refused to surrender. She remembered every night shift and every quiet morning lesson about courage. The neighbor's radio murmured a hymn that made the air feel almost merciful. Elena said, "Lock the chain, Mason," and the small click sounded like a vow signed in steel. The narrator knew the storm was only pausing to inhale. The apartment breathed a new quiet that felt earned and fragile. The narrator traced the lines of fatigue under Elena's eyes as she made cocoa on a humming stove. Mason said, "Can we sleep now?" and the question floated like a paper boat. Elena said, "Soon, champ. We'll make a fort," and she winked, stitching ease into the room. The kettle clicked and released a small cloud that smelled like calm. She wiped the table and set 2 chipped mugs side by side, a ritual that never broke. The hallway creaked but did not threaten, and the chain held without drama. Elena opened the window a finger's width and let rain hush the edges. She checked the peephole once more and counted her breaths. The narrator felt her spine straighten around a plan she dared not name. Mason said, "You always fix it," and Elena smiled like a lighthouse in fog. Outside, the city kept its secrets, and the night bent without breaking. Morning arrived thin and gray, slipping under the blinds with careful hands. The narrator watched Elena pack a lunch while the world pretended nothing had cracked. Mason said, "Do I have to go?" and she kissed his forehead and nodded. Elena said, "Routine is our armor," and the words felt like a shield. The toaster popped and startled them both into a laugh that stayed. A calendar on the wall bore court dates that blinked like warning lights. She slid documents into her bag with a reverence saved for brittle things. The hallway mirror caught her and offered a braver stranger. Mason said, "Will you be there after school?" and she said, "Always." Keys chimed in her palm with a brave, ordinary music. The narrator felt the day open, narrow but passable, like a bridge in fog. The street smelled of wet concrete and bakery sugar that tried to sweeten the edges. The narrator followed Elena as she walked Mason to school with measured steps. Mason said, "Will Mr. Tate ask about the drawing?" and she squeezed his hand. Elena said, "Tell him you finished it," and the plan felt like a ribbon tied tight. Cars hissed by in a river of patient noise. She waved to Ava across the crosswalk, a signal that meant later, talk. Ava said, "Text me if he shows," and the promise sat like backup light. The crossing guard lifted a hand, and the world paused politely. Mason said, "Love you," and Elena sent him through the doors with a steady smile. The narrator felt the street resume its grind as she stood alone. She tucked a stray hair behind her ear like a small salute to control. Silence rode home with Elena like an uninvited passenger. The narrator mocked the way she checked mirrors for ghosts and found only rain. The apartment opened with the same sigh as last night, familiar and wary. Elena said, "Okay, we file, we call, we breathe," and the list steadied her pulse. She set papers on the table and dialed the number she avoided. "I'm..." A calm voice answered, and she asked for a consultation with careful clarity. The pen in her hand tapped a rhythm that sounded like courage learning to walk. She booked the earliest slot and wrote it twice on the calendar. The radiator clanked and settled like an old ally returning to post. Elena said, "One step at a time," and the room agreed. The narrator felt the day gather itself, not gentle, but obedient to intent. The office smelled of ink and stale coffee, and the fluorescent lights hummed like restless insects. The narrator watched Elena adjust her blazer and paced on a smile as if it were armor. Her desk was stacked with folders that towered like fragile walls. A coworker whispered about deadlines, and her pulse climbed, though she nodded calmly. Elena said, "I'll handle it," and the words sounded stronger than she felt. Emails blinked with demands that clawed at her focus, and each ring of the phone shook her rhythm. She thought of Mason's smile that morning, the only reason she stayed upright. The copier jammed, and frustration scraped her patience raw. Still, she carried the weight of responsibility with a spine that refused to bend. The narrator knew that beneath every paper shuffled was a truth. She was fighting battles no one else could see, and the cracks in her foundation were spreading. The break room's hum was softer, but betrayal lurked in whispers sharper than knives. The narrator caught the moment Elena froze when Ava leaned closer with guarded eyes. Ava said, "He called here," and the words landed like a stone in glass. Elena gripped her mug, heat scalding her palm more than the coffee inside. She asked, "What did you tell him?" And her tone was a blade wrapped in velvet. Ava looked away, lips pressed thin, and silence answered louder than speech. Elena's chest tightened with disbelief that trust could fracture so swiftly. The vending machine clunked, filling the air with a hollow echo of cheap sweetness. Elena said, "I needed you," and her voice carried the ache of years bound in friendship. The narrator knew a friendship bent by secrets was harder to mend than broken glass. At the kitchen table, bills sprawled like accusations written in ink. The narrator watched Elena press her temples as numbers danced, cruel and relentless. Mason's drawing lay beside the overdue notices, a burst of color against gray despair. Elena said, "We'll find a way," and she scribbled calculations with a broken pencil. Each added line only deepened the canyon of what she lacked. The radiator hissed like a critic with no mercy, reminding her of rent due in days. Mason padded in and said, "Mom, can we get pizza?" And innocence tugged at her chest. She smiled weakly, saying, "Tomorrow, champ," though tomorrow felt heavier than stone. The clock ticked with mocking rhythm, counting down to choices she didn't want to make. The narrator understood that survival wasn't just about food or shelter, but about holding dignity while the walls closed in. Elena tucked Mason into bed, his small hands clutching a worn teddy as questions filled the dark. The narrator felt the sting when he whispered, "Are we losing home?" And silence seemed cruel. She kissed his forehead, answering, "No, you're safe," though her stomach churned at the lie. Mason's eyes, wide with knowing, held more wisdom than a child should bear. She smoothed the blanket, willing her own fears into quiet. Outside, rain tapped the glass in a rhythm of old lullabies. Mason said, "Why does Dad yell?" And her throat closed like a locked door. Elena said, "He forgets how to be kind," and the truth was both simple and brutal. The nightlight glowed soft gold, protecting him from monsters she couldn't chase away. The narrator lingered on her face, painted with strength she didn't feel, but forced to embody. The phone vibrated against the counter, and Alva's name lit the screen like unfinished business. The narrator followed Elena's hand as it hovered, reluctant but desperate. She answered with clipped breath, and Ava said, "I'm sorry," voice cracking with guilt. Elena leaned against the wall, her pulse loud as thunder, words forming slower than her pain. She said, "You broke trust," and the silence afterward stretched like a taut rope. Ava's voice pleaded, "I thought he'd stop if I helped," and excuses fell hollow. Elena pressed her forehead to the cool plaster, gathering the fragments of resolve. Mason stirred in the other room, and she whispered, "I can't afford betrayal." The narrator noted how friendship could fracture into shards sharp enough to wound both ways. The call ended, leaving Elena alone with the hum of the refrigerator and the weight of loss. The courthouse air tasted like paper dust and victory claimed too soon. The narrator tracked Elena's steps as she faced a clerk who would not meet her eyes. The file, stamped urgent, glowed like a flare. Daniel said, "See you in court," and walked past with a smile that cut. His attorney said, "We'll seek emergency relief," and the phrase coiled tight. Elena said, "I will contest," and the words anchored her to the floor. She signed for papers that weighed more than ink. Overhead lights buzzed like relentless wasps. A deputy held the door and nodded, as if mercy were policy. Elena tucked documents into her bag and straightened the strap. She whispered, "We fight smart," and the hallway seemed shorter. The narrator felt the shift as anger cooled into strategy sharp enough to hold. Back home, the envelope waited like a storm sealed in white. The narrator watched Elena slice it open and breathe through each clause. The motion read like a map of traps. She said, "Not today," and marked the margins in red. Mason drew superheroes in the next room, a chorus of crayons masking dread. The radiator ticked time for her pulse. She called a clinic and asked for sliding fees with a voice built for calm. The receptionist said, "Bring documentation," and hope shifted an inch. Elena said, "I will," and stacked exhibits like bricks for a wall. Rain began, tapping the window like a quiet ally. She scanned pages, naming each tactic aloud as if shrinking it. The narrator held the room steady while fear tried to flex its rule. The social services office was painted in patience, beige and quiet. The narrator watched Karen review a checklist that could tilt a life. Karen said, "Describe your support network," and her tone was careful glass. Elena said, "I work, I plan, I show up," and her posture did not flinch. Karen said, "There are reports of conflict," and the words tested the floor. Elena named nights of calm, routines that held, and teachers who could vouch. Karen noted, pen whispering across paper like small weather. Elena said, "My son is safe," and the sentence landed steady. A clock sighed past the hour while a copier purred like distant surf. Karen said, "Home visit scheduled," and the box clicked. The narrator marked Elena's breath as it deepened into something like resolve. After pickup, the playground held a thin sun and kinder noises. The narrator saw Elena tie Mason's laces while scanning the gate. Noah waved from the bench with a hesitant warmth. "Noah," said, "you left your file at the clinic," and offered a manila folder like a truce. Elena said, "Thank you," and relief threaded her voice. Mason said, "Is he your friend?" and curiosity softened the air. Noah said, "I run evenings at the rec center," and the space widened around them. Elena weighed safety and need and the measure of a smile. A gust lifted the swings in a slow pendulum of calm. She said, "Maybe we could talk schedules," and the ground felt less fragile. The narrator filed the moment under human help that does not demand interest. Evening folded in, and the phone lit with a name that still hurt. The narrator listened as Ava spoke before apology could settle. Ava said, "He cornered me at work," and fear vibrated under each word. Elena said, "Boundaries now," and the steel surprised them both. Ava said, "He promised to help you," and the lie sounded tired. Elena said, "He helps himself," and the truth cleared fog from the room. A bus sighed outside like an old witness. Ava said, "Don't trust that new guy," and the warning dangled like a frayed rope. Elena said, "I vet everyone," and the promise was to herself. She ended the call and leaned against the counter until breath matched a calmer drum. The narrator understood that trust, once cracked, must be rebuilt in measured light. The narrator lingered on the tension as Elena walked into Ava's apartment, the smell of betrayal sharper than perfume. Ava said, "I didn't mean for it to go this far," her voice trembling under guilt. Elena said, "You gave him ammunition," and the words cracked like thunder. Ava wrung her hands, eyes darting to the floor, searching for mercy not yet earned. Elena said, "I trusted you with everything," and silence dropped heavy as stone. The ticking of a clock counted down to something irreparable. Ava said, "He promised he just wanted peace," and excuses burned hollow in the air. Elena's jaw set, her body angled toward the door, but her eyes still ached with loss. The narrator watched as friendship, once a lifeline, unraveled into threads too thin to hold. The rain drummed outside as Elena faced Daniel in a parking lot, each word sharp as broken glass. Daniel said, "You'll never keep him from me," his voice echoing against concrete. Elena said, I'll protect Mason, no matter what, her tone low but burning. Daniel stepped closer, his shadow looming like an old wound reopened. The narrator marked the flash of defiance in Elena's eyes as she refused to retreat. Daniel said, "You can't win in court," his smirk a dagger sharpened by arrogance. Elena said, "Truth doesn't need to win, it just needs to be heard," her grip tightening on her umbrella like a shield. Lightning flickered above, painting both faces with raw defiance. The space between them was small, but the gulf of trust was endless. Mason's eyes brimmed as the shouting from the hall bled into his room. The narrator followed, his trembling hands clutching the teddy tighter than breath. He whispered, "Why are they fighting?" But no answer came, only echoes. Elena rushed in, face pale, words caught between protection and apology. She said, "You don't have to listen to that noise," pulling the blanket over his shoulders. Mason said, "He scares me," his voice a broken whisper. Elena said, "He can't touch you here," her hand smoothing his hair with trembling care. The nightlight burned a golden circle, a fragile shield against chaos. The narrator mocked how a child's fear carved deeper wounds than adult battles could reveal. Elena sat at the kitchen table, a photo album open like a wound stitched with memories. The narrator traced images of birthdays, holidays, smiles that once felt whole. She whispered, "I gave up everything for this family," her voice breaking into the silence. A flashback tugged her into nights of double shifts and mornings of exhaustion. She saw herself holding Mason as a baby, promising him a future safe from storms. The album page turned to a wedding photo, Daniel's hand resting on hers with false ease. Elena said how blind I was, and bitterness seeped like ink through water. The kettle whistled, grounding her back into the present's sharp edges. The narrator knew memory was a mirror she could no longer avoid, even if it cracked her reflection. The courthouse loomed again, as Elena clutched a folder that held her future in fragile sheets. The narrator marked her steps, slower but deliberate, like drums before a storm. She said, "I won't break." The vow whispered into concrete walls. The crowd of strangers moved past, blind to the war she carried inside. A security guard nodded, the gesture small but grounding. Elena pressed her ID across the desk, the motion steady despite her trembling hands. Daniel waited on the other side, his smirk already sharpened. She whispered, "This is just the beginning," eyes locked forward. The clock inside ticked down to the hearing that could rewrite her life. The narrator felt the world tighten into a stage where every breath mattered. The narrator followed Elena's steps as she froze at the door, the knock steady but unfamiliar. She opened it to find Margaret standing there, her mother, a face she hadn't seen in years. Margaret said, "I heard what's happening," her voice carrying a weight of unfinished history. Elena said, "You left when I needed you most," her words sharp but trembling. Margaret lowered her eyes, clutching a worn leather bag that smelled of old journeys. The hallway light flickered, making the moment feel both fragile and unsteady. Mason peeked from behind Elena, wide-eyed with curiosity and confusion. Margaret said, "I want to help," and the words fell heavy between them. Elena's breath caught, unsure whether to slam the door or open her arms. The narrator lingered on the silence that carried decades of pain. Inside the apartment, the air felt crowded with ghosts. The narrator watched as Elena set teacups on the table with shaking hands. "Well, Margaret said, "I should have come back sooner," her voice frayed by remorse. Elena said, "You had decades," her tone brittle as glass. Mason sat quietly, sketching shapes on a napkin, pretending not to listen. Margaret unfolded a photo from her bag, showing Elena as a child with a smile untouched by betrayal. Elena looked away, jaw set, her body rigid against memory's sting. Margaret said, "I've been watching from afar," the confession falling like a stone into water. Elena whispered, "Distance doesn't heal abandonment," the pain slicing through her resolve. The narrator marked how every word deepened the chasm that help could not yet bridge. The tension grew thicker, and Margaret leaned forward, her voice trembling. Margaret said, I can testify for you. I can tell the court who Daniel really is." Elena's eyes flashed, torn between anger and hope. She said, "Why now?" her voice sharp as splintered glass. Margaret said, "Because I couldn't bear losing both you and my grandson," regret flooding her tone. Mason looked up, sensing the gravity despite his age. Elena's chest rose heavy, her mind racing through memories of broken promises. She said, "Your help has a price," and the suspicion sharpened her words. Margaret whispered, "The price is forgiveness," and the air stiffened under the weight of the request. The narrator felt the moment tip, a balance between the past's ruin and the future's fragile chance. Elena paced the narrow hallway, the floor creaking with every step, her thoughts colliding like storms. She whispered, "Can I trust her?" her voice barely audible. Margaret stood at the end, silent, letting her presence speak. Mason came close and said, "She looks like you," his innocent observation a quiet dagger. Elena stopped, hand pressing to the wall, eyes closed against the ache of old scars. Margaret said, "I can't erase the past, but I can stand with you now," her voice a trembling vow. Elena's chest heaved, torn between fury and longing for support. The radiator clanked as if echoing the argument neither could finish. The narrator marked how every second stretched like wire pulled too thin, ready to snap or bind. At the kitchen table again, Margaret unfolded, a document she had kept hidden for years. The narrator tracked Elena's widening eyes as the paper revealed financial records of Daniel's lies. Margaret said, "He's been laundering money," her tone sharp with proof. Elena whispered, "This could destroy him," her fingers tracing the damning lines. Mason shifted in his chair, sensing change in the air. Margaret said, "I didn't know until it was too late," guilt clinging to every syllable. Elena's breath trembled, but her spine straightened with renewed resolve. She said, "Then this is how we fight," determination sparking from ashes of doubt. The refrigerator hummed low, underscoring the shift from fear to strategy. The narrator felt the moment seal, a truth buried now unearthed, ready to turn the tide. The courthouse breathed a cold hush as the hearing called them to order, and nerves sharpened like glass. The narrator followed Elena's steps as she took her seat, spine straight as a drawn line. Daniel sat across the aisle, calm as a mask, whispering to Victor, and the smirk returned. Clara said, "We will show a pattern of coercion," and her voice carried clean steel. Judge Patel said, "Keep this orderly," and the room adjusted around that measured gravity. Elena gripped a pen as if it were an anchor, and her breath found a steady drum. Daniel said, "I'm the stable parent," and the claim slid across marble like oil. Clara placed exhibits in neat rows, each page a lantern in fog. The bailiff shifted, and the air held its breath as if clocks paused. The narrator felt the stage set for truth, dressed in paper and ink. Elena said, "I am ready," and the promise lived in how she did not flinch. Clara said, "We admit Exhibit H," and the projector bloomed with numbers that glowed like sirens. The narrator traced the columns as they stitched a path from Daniel's accounts to shadowed shells. Daniel said, "Misinterpretation," and Victor echoed the word as if repetition could sand edges. Clara said, "Explain these transfers near rent day," and silence flexed its muscle. Margaret watched from the gallery, hands clasped, breath clipped in small knots. Elena felt a tremor and pressed her palm flat to the table until calm returned. Daniel said, "Business float," but the line wavered, thin as smoke. Clara pointed to timestamps that matched text threats, and the room leaned forward. Judge Patel said, "Answer directly," and the gavel's absence still carried weight. The narrator tasted the shift as certainty moved toward Elena like a tide. Daniel's eyes flicked to the exit, and the bravado lost color. Elena took the stand, and the oath settled on her shoulders like armor forged overnight. The narrator held close as she described schedules, charts, and mornings stitched with small mercies. Elena said, "He raised his voice by choice," and the sentence carried a clean edge. Victor said, "You exaggerate conflict," and the suggestion slid without traction. Elena explained school pickups, clinic emails and calendars marked in careful ink. She said, "Mason sleeps when the home is quiet," and the room softened, just a fraction. Victor asked, "You're overwhelmed?" and she answered, "I am organized." Clara placed a teacher letter like a compass, no wind could tilt. Elena said, "My son is safe with me," and the words landed with a steady thud. The narrator watched the jurist lean forward, not swayed, but listening deep. Strength, once borrowed, felt owned, and it showed in the way Elena breathed. Karen entered with a clipboard, and the room reset to clinical clarity that trimmed rumor to bone. The narrator tracked her even cadence as she named site visits, observations and routines logged. Karen said, "The child presents bonded, regulated, and academically steady," and pens stopped moving. Victor said, "Any concerns?" and she replied, "Noise exposure during conflict offsite." Elena looked down, grief passing like a cloud, then clearing to blue. Clara said, "Home environment," and Karen answered, "Clean, consistent, age-appropriate structure." Daniel shifted, a small storm inside a tailored frame. Judge Patel said, "Thank you, Miss Lee," and the compliment was in the brevity. The room measured the weight of professional words and found them heavy. The narrator marked how evidence wears no perfume yet fills every corner. Elena exhaled slow, and the bench took note. Closing arguments gathered like weather, and everyone felt the pressure change. The narrator stood with Clara as she said, "Stability is conduct, not claim," and the phrase rang true. Victor replied, "Fatherhood deserves equal weight," but the numbers still glowed on the wall. Clara said, "Protect the child," and the words drew a circle no storm could breach. Elena kept her eyes on the bench, not on Daniel, not on fear, only on what mattered. Daniel stared back, rage cooled into calculation, but the room no longer tilted his way. Judge Patel said, "The court will rule," and quiet settled, firm as stone. Elena squeezed the pen that had steadied her, and found she didn't need it now. The narrator felt a chord resolve, not triumphant, but undeniably aligned. In the hush, hope did not shout. It breathed, and it stayed. The narrator held the silence as Judge Patel spoke the verdict, each word deliberate and final. She said, "Custody is granted to the mother," and the courtroom shifted like air after thunder. Elena closed her eyes, shoulders trembling but unbroken. Daniel's jaw clenched, his smirk dissolved into ash. Clara whispered, "You did it," though the cost lingered heavy. Margaret pressed her palms together, relief and regret mingling in the gallery. Elena opened her eyes, gaze steady on Mason's future instead of Daniel's shadow. The gavel struck once, and the room exhaled in unison. Outside the courthouse, the city hummed as if unaware of battles just won. Elena stood at the steps, folder pressed to her chest like a shield finally at rest. Margaret said, "I'm proud of you," her voice unsteady but sincere. Elena said, "This was for Mason," eyes fixed on a horizon wider than grief. Reporters called out questions, flashes snapping, but Clara guided her down the steps with calm assurance. Daniel lingered near the curb, rage burning quiet, but he did not cross the line. The narrator traced Elena's breath, deeper than in years, as if air finally belonged to her again. At home, the apartment no longer felt like a cage, but a sanctuary born. Mason rushed into Elena's arms, his laughter ringing louder than fear. He said, "You're staying," his voice both question and certainty. Elena kissed his forehead, whispering, "Always my heart." The teddy bear lay on the couch, no longer a shield, but a companion in joy. Margaret lingered by the doorway, watching with softened eyes. The narrator noted how rooms shift when burdens lift, light bending warmer through old curtains. For the first time in years, Elena's smile did not tremble. Later that evening, Elena sat by the window, tea steaming in her hands. The narrator traced her reflection, steadier than storms could bend. She whispered, "I can rebuild," and the city lights blinked back like witnesses. Margaret joined her with quiet footsteps, resting a hand on her shoulder. Margaret said, I'll stay this time, and the words settled like balm on old wounds. Elena nodded, not ready to forgive fully, but ready to accept presence. The night stretched wide, no longer suffocating, but holding possibility. For once the silence did not weigh, it healed. The narrator closed with the quiet rhythm of peace as Elena stood at Mason's bedroom door. She placed her hand gently on the frame, watching him sleep, his breath even and safe. She whispered, "We're stronger now," her voice a vow to herself as much as to him. The room glowed with nightlight amber, walls no longer echoing with fear but with calm. Elena sat beside him, smile breaking pure and unmasked. She said, "We'll never stop fighting," the promise sealed in the hush of night. The future was uncertain, but her strength was not. In that stillness, freedom felt real.